The neighborhood was unusually quiet that afternoon. Sunlight rested gently on the trimmed lawns, and children's laughter carried faintly from the park. Among them was a young black boy, riding his bike with a sense of joy that only childhood can bring. His bicycle was a little old, its chain clicking softly with every turn of the pedals, but his smile was bright and carefree. For him, it was just another ordinary day of play. He had no idea that this simple ride would spark an incident that the whole community would never forget. The HOA president, a man who had long been known for his strict, controlling attitude, walked through the neighborhood with his usual air of authority. He was a figure that made many residents uneasy. He prided himself on keeping order in the community, but his definition of order often meant intimidation and rigid enforcement of minor rules. That day, his sharp eyes spotted the boy riding near the community park. The path where the boy pedaled was technically meant for walkers, but children often rode their bikes there without issue. To most people, it was harmless. To the HOA president, however, it felt like a personal challenge to his authority. He stopped abruptly, his expression hardening as he watched the child. The boy, unaware of being observed, continued his ride, occasionally glancing at the sky as if dreaming of adventures far beyond the quiet neighborhood. The HOA president's jaw tightened. He felt a sense of power rise within him, as if the neighborhood rules he enforced gave him ownership over the lives of others. He marched forward, his polished shoes striking the pavement with a cold determination. The child slowed his bike when he noticed the man blocking the path. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said softly, his voice polite, the way his mother had taught him to speak to elders. But the man's response was not kindness. His words came out sharp, demanding to know why the boy was on that path, why he dared to break the rules. The child, confused and nervous, explained that he was just riding for fun, not meaning to hurt anyone. But the HOA president was not listening. His tone grew harsher, his face red with anger. Neighbors nearby began to notice. A woman walking her dog paused, pulling out her phone as she sensed the tension building. A couple sitting on their porch turned their heads toward the commotion. Something in the air shifted, and people knew this was not just another scolding from the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. The boy tried to step back, his hands trembling on the handlebars of his bike. His eyes darted around, looking for help. The HOA president's voice rose louder, echoing across the quiet street. The dog-walking woman began recording, her hand unsteady but determined. The moment was tense, and everyone could feel it. Without warning, the president shoved the boy's bike aside, causing him to stumble. The child cried out in surprise, landing on the ground with his knees scraping against the pavement. His stuffed bunny, tied to the handlebars with a bit of ribbon, fell to the side. The sight of the toy lying in the dirt struck a chord with those watching. It was a clear reminder that this was not just a boy, but a child, innocent and undeserving of such treatment. Gasps echoed from the few neighbors watching. The woman with the dog shouted for the man to stop, her voice trembling but firm. Another man ran forward, helping the boy to his feet, while glaring at the HOA president. Phones were now raised higher, capturing every second. The HOA president stood tall, his hands on his hips, his expression unrepentant. He believed he was in the right. He believed the community would side with him, as they often had before when he acted with arrogance. The boy's lip quivered as he held his scraped knee, his eyes filling with tears. But more than pain, there was confusion in his face, confusion about why someone older, someone meant to guide and protect, would treat him so cruelly. The bystander who had helped him up placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, whispering, "It's okay, son. You're safe now." But the child knew deep down that something serious had just happened. The HOA president muttered about rules and order, dismissing the crowd's outrage. Yet, as he glanced around, he noticed the stares were not of support, but of anger. Neighbors whispered to one another, their voices carrying, "He went too far this time. That poor boy. This is unacceptable." The mother of the child soon arrived, rushing down the street after receiving a frantic call from a neighbor. She dropped to her knees beside her son, her arms wrapping around him protectively. Her voice shook with both fear and fury as she asked what happened. When she looked up, her eyes locked on the HOA president. For a moment, silence fell, and only the child's soft sobs could be heard. Phones remained raised. The weight of witnesses hung heavy in the air. It was no longer just an incident, it was evidence, captured and ready to be shared beyond the boundaries of their quiet street. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably, sensing for the first time that perhaps his power was slipping away. What he did not know, what no one in the neighborhood yet realized, was that this child was not just any boy. His father was a man whose presence could shake entire institutions. His father was someone who lived by justice, by principle, and by strength. The attack on this innocent child would not be brushed aside. The boy, still clutching his mother's hand, looked back at the path where his bike now lay on its side. The day that began with laughter and freedom had turned into something heavy, something that would change everything. And as neighbors exchanged worried glances, the first wave of whispers began to spread. This was not going to stay quiet. This was only the beginning. Neighbors did not sleep easily that night. What had happened in the park was replayed in everyone's mind, and the quiet suburban community suddenly felt unsettled. A few had captured the scene on their phones, and by the time the evening fell, short video clips had already been shared on neighborhood chats and even on social media. What started as whispers on the street now carried far beyond the gates of their community. The boy's mother sat by his side at home. She gently cleaned the scrapes on his knees, her heart aching each time he winced. He was still shaken, his eyes wide and his voice soft as he recounted how the HOA president had shouted at him and pushed him. She hugged him tightly, whispering promises of safety, though inside, she was boiling with anger. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that the HOA president was arrogant, but she never imagined he would cross the line and harm a child. Especially her child. While she comforted her son, outside the story grew bigger. Neighbors argued among themselves. Some said the president should resign immediately. Others whispered nervously about the bad reputation their community might face if the media got involved. "We can't have cameras and reporters here," one man complained during an impromptu meeting at his driveway. But others stood firm. "What about that boy? He could have been seriously hurt. Are we really going to stay silent again?" For years, the HOA president had carried himself like a ruler of the neighborhood. He fined families for leaving trash cans out too long, scolded teenagers for sitting on the curb, and even told a family to repaint their house because he didn't like the shade of blue. Many disliked him, but most stayed quiet to avoid conflict. But this time was different. This was not about trash cans or paint colors. This was about a child. As the videos spread, more voices joined in. People who once stayed silent began sharing their own experiences. One woman wrote online about how the HOA president had singled her out for planting flowers along the sidewalk. Another recalled how he once threatened to tow her car for parking an inch too far from the curb. Each story painted a picture of a man who enjoyed control more than community. But the strongest voice came from the mother. The very next morning, she spoke calmly yet firmly at a neighborhood gathering. With her son holding her hand, she told everyone what had happened. Her words were clear, and though she fought back tears, her voice never wavered. "He is a child," she said. "A child who was simply riding his bike. He was treated like he didn't belong here, like his safety didn't matter. No parent should ever have to see their child hurt like that in their own neighborhood." The crowd was silent. Even those who had tried to defend the president now looked uneasy. Eyes shifted from her to the man at the center of it all. The HOA president stood nearby, arms crossed, his jaw set tight. Instead of apologizing, he scoffed. He insisted he had only been defending the rules. He claimed the child should not have been on the path and that he had the right to enforce order. His words, once accepted by fearful neighbors, now sounded hollow in the open air. Whispers spread through the crowd. Phones recorded every word. The president's arrogance only fueled the fire. "This isn't about rules," someone shouted back. "This is about what's right." Another voice joined, "You went too far, and you know it." For the first time, the man who had ruled with fear was surrounded by open defiance. Meanwhile, beyond the community gates, people online were outraged. The video had gained traction on social platforms overnight. Comments poured in from strangers who didn't even live there. "Unbelievable. That poor boy. How could anyone do that to a child?" News outlets began contacting residents, eager to confirm details. A story that had begun as a neighborhood argument was on the verge of becoming national news. At home, the boy's father was quietly informed of what had happened. He was a man who often dealt with high-stakes situations, yet nothing prepared him for the sight of his son's scraped knees and frightened eyes. He knelt beside his boy, speaking softly, promising him that he was safe and that what had been done to him would not be ignored. The father's calm presence gave the family strength, though he knew the storm was only beginning. The neighbors who once feared the HOA president now started to unite. Families who had barely spoken to each other began talking about action. They called for an emergency HOA meeting. They drafted letters demanding accountability. And all the while, the president continued to stand proud, believing he was untouchable. He believed that the same silence that had protected him for years would protect him again. But this time was different. This time, people had seen too much. Children had cried watching their friend hurt. Parents had felt their hearts break seeing a little boy treated as less. Phones had captured every second, and the world had already begun to watch. The story was no longer just about a neighborhood president and a boy on a bike. It was about power, about arrogance, and about what happens when someone abuses authority in plain sight. It was about a community deciding whether they would stand with what was easy or with what was right. And as the sun set on the second day, one truth became clear: the HOA president had started something he could no longer control. The neighborhood was awake now, and so was the world outside their gates. The morning after the neighborhood meeting felt heavier than usual. Families whispered to one another as they walked their children to school, and parents exchanged worried looks, unsure how far this incident would go. The HOA president moved about as if nothing had happened, wearing the same smug expression, convinced that the storm would soon pass. He had been through complaints before, and he always believed he was too powerful in the neighborhood to ever face real consequences. But this time, there was a detail he did not yet know, a detail that would change everything. The boy's mother had spent the night comforting her son, but she also knew it was time to call her husband. He was away on official duties, but when she told him what had happened, his voice on the phone grew quiet, filled with controlled fury. He was not just a father, he was the director of the FBI, a man whose presence commanded respect across the nation. For years, he had carried the weight of responsibility, ensuring justice was served at the highest level. And now, injustice had reached his own home. When word spread quietly among the neighbors that the boy was the FBI director's son, shock rippled through the community. People who had been hesitant to speak out suddenly felt braver. They realized that this was no longer just a neighborhood squabble, this was something much bigger. The arrogant HOA president had not simply bullied a child, he had attacked the son of one of the most powerful law enforcement leaders in the country. By mid-morning, unmarked cars were seen near the neighborhood. They did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights but carried an air of seriousness. Men and women in suits stepped out, discreet yet watchful, their eyes scanning the area. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering nervously, "This is bigger than we thought." When the FBI director himself arrived, the atmosphere shifted completely. He was not dressed in his formal suit but in simple clothes, yet his presence was undeniable. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of authority. He walked directly to his home, where his son ran into his arms. The director knelt, pulling the boy close, whispering soft words of comfort that only a father could say. Neighbors watching from afar felt a lump in their throats at the tender moment. After ensuring his son was safe, the director asked to meet the HOA president face to face. The man, still clinging to his pride, stepped forward with a stiff posture. For a moment, the two men stood opposite one another, the president who thrived on small power and the director who carried true responsibility. The director's voice was calm, but it cut through the air with precision. You put your hands on a child. My child. You will answer for that. His words were not shouted, but their weight was heavier than any scream. The HOA president tried to defend himself, muttering about rules, order, and community guidelines. But his words seemed to crumble in the silence that followed. Neighbors no longer nodded along with him. Instead, they looked at him with disappointment and anger. It was clear to everyone that his excuses held no strength in the face of what he had done. The director did not raise his voice further. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said firmly, "Justice will be served." With that, he turned and walked away, his presence leaving the president rattled. Within hours, reporters began arriving at the gates of the community, tipped off by the spreading news online. Cameras pointed, microphones reached out, and questions filled the air. Did the HOA president assault a child? Is it true the victim is the FBI director's son? The neighborhood, once quiet and private, was now the center of national attention. Families who had stayed silent before were now eager to share their experiences with the press. They spoke about years of intimidation, about unfair treatment, and about how the president had abused his role for too long. Each new testimony added weight to the case building against him. The president, who once strutted around with authority, now avoided the cameras. His confident walk was replaced with hurried steps. His phone buzzed constantly with calls, but he had fewer and fewer allies left to answer. Even the HOA board, once supportive, began distancing themselves. They knew the tide had turned. At home, the young boy finally began to smile again, feeling safe in his father's presence. He sat beside him, holding his hand, while the director reminded him gently, "You did nothing wrong. You have nothing to fear. What happened to you was wrong, and it will not be ignored." The boy's mother, her heart finally easing, watched her family with quiet relief. The revelation had shifted the story entirely. No longer was it about a child being mistreated by a local authority figure, it was about accountability at every level. It was about how even the most powerful titles in a small community meant nothing when justice stood against them. The neighborhood knew change was coming. The HOA president had finally met a force he could not intimidate or silence. And as the sun set that evening, one thing became clear: this was no longer his kingdom. The community, the media, and the law itself were now watching closely, waiting for the justice that the boy and every family he had mistreated deserved. The days that followed felt like a storm that would not stop. What had begun as a neighborhood argument was now on television screens across the country. News anchors repeated the story again and again: a homeowners association president accused of mistreating a child, who happened to be the son of the FBI director. The details spread like fire. Video clips played on loop, showing the moment the boy fell to the ground and the faces of neighbors shouting in disbelief. In the neighborhood itself, life was turned upside down. Cars lined the entrance gates as reporters set up cameras. Microphones stretched out at residents who only wanted to walk their dogs or drive to work. Some tried to avoid attention by sneaking through side exits, while others spoke openly, telling journalists about the years of intimidation they had endured under the HOA president's rule. Every new interview chipped away at the president's image. Residents described fines for minor issues, threats for leaving holiday decorations up too long, and harassment aimed mostly at families who looked different or spoke out. It became clear that this was not just about one boy, it was about a pattern of behavior that had gone on for years. The president, once proud and confident, now found himself cornered. He tried to issue a statement through the HOA board, claiming he was misunderstood, that the situation was exaggerated. But the words did not land. The board, sensing the weight of public anger, quickly distanced themselves. They called for an emergency vote to suspend him from his duties, something no one imagined possible just weeks before. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak now came forward boldly. They attended the board meeting, filling the room until there was no space left. Voices rose one after another. He threatened my kids for playing basketball in the driveway. He told me I didn't belong in this community. We've all been silent too long. The room buzzed with energy, each story exposing a piece of the truth. The president sat in silence, his usual smirk gone, his face pale. Beyond the neighborhood, legal authorities began to take interest. Local police confirmed that a report had been filed, and the case was under investigation. Federal authorities quietly gathered information as well, though they did so with care, since the victim was the FBI director's son. The message was clear: there would be no favoritism, but there would also be no escape from accountability. Media pressure only grew stronger. Headlines described him as a bully in power and a man who misused authority. Editorial pieces called for stricter oversight of homeowners associations, saying what happened here was a lesson for communities everywhere. The once proud president became a symbol of arrogance gone too far. At home, the boy slowly regained his laughter, thanks to the comfort of his parents. His father, though carrying the weight of national responsibilities, made time to sit with him, play board games, and remind him that courage mattered even when others were unkind. The family's quiet moments together stood in stark contrast to the chaos outside. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered more about the president's past. Old financial records revealed questionable spending of HOA funds. Complaints that had been dismissed years ago were reopened. What had begun as a single incident was now a full unraveling of his legacy. Each revelation turned more neighbors against him, leaving him isolated. The backlash was not only legal but personal. Friends he once dined with avoided him. Families crossed the street rather than greet him. Even those who had once admired his authority could not defend what the world had now seen with their own eyes. The FBI director, though careful not to overstep his role as a father and a leader, made one rare public statement. Standing before cameras, he spoke calmly: "Every child deserves to feel safe in their community. What happened to my son was wrong. This is not just about him, it is about the responsibility we all share to treat others with dignity and respect." His words were measured, but they carried the full force of his authority. For the neighborhood, his statement was a turning point. People who had hesitated now stepped forward with determination. They realized that their silence had allowed injustice to grow, and they no longer wanted to be part of that silence. The HOA president faced not just angry neighbors, but the collapse of everything he had built his identity upon. His title was stripped, his reputation destroyed, and legal proceedings loomed ahead. He had once believed himself untouchable, but now he stood alone, a man brought down by his own pride and cruelty. And yet, for the community, it was also a moment of hope. They began to meet not in fear, but in unity. Parents planned safer spaces for children to play. Neighbors who had once avoided each other started to talk, sharing stories not of rules and fines, but of kindness and support. The shadow that had hung over the neighborhood for years was lifting, and in its place came a new sense of belonging. The boy, though young, had unknowingly sparked a change. His pain had opened eyes, and his courage in facing it became an example for many. He no longer rode his bike with fear, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew he was valued and protected. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a community learning to stand together, proving that even in the face of arrogance and abuse, truth and justice would always rise. The courtroom was full on the day of the hearing. Reporters lined the entrance, cameras flashing as residents filed inside to witness what they believed would be a turning point. For weeks, the community had been shaken, but today there was a sense of calm determination. People wanted to see justice done. They wanted to know that their voices mattered. The HOA president entered the room with his head slightly lowered, a far cry from the proud man who once strutted across manicured lawns giving orders. His suit, once a symbol of authority, now looked wrinkled and heavy on him. He avoided eye contact with the neighbors who had gathered. Every face seemed to remind him of the power he had lost. When the case was presented, the evidence was undeniable. Videos played on the screen, showing the moment he had pushed the boy's bike and caused him to fall. Witnesses spoke clearly about what they saw, each one describing the incident with consistency and emotion. Even those who once feared him now stood tall, their voices steady. They were not just speaking for the boy, they were speaking for themselves, for years of silence that had allowed his arrogance to grow. The boy's mother testified, her voice calm but strong. She described her son's fear, his confusion, and the sleepless nights he endured afterward. She looked directly at the man who had caused it and said, "You tried to treat my child as if he did not matter. But he matters. Every child matters." The courtroom grew quiet, her words echoing in the stillness. When the FBI director finally spoke, his presence filled the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words carried the weight of justice. "I am here today not as the director of the FBI, but as a father. No child should be harmed for simply being themselves, for playing, for living in their own neighborhood. Authority is not power over others, it is responsibility to protect others." This man forgot that, and today, we must remember it. The judge listened carefully, and when the decision came, it was firm. The HOA president was found guilty of assault and misconduct. He faced penalties not only in fines and community service but also in the permanent loss of his position. His reign over the neighborhood was officially over. He would no longer be able to dictate, intimidate, or control. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around the families. But instead of division, they found unity. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now stood side by side. Parents embraced, children played nearby, and for the first time in years, the community felt truly free. The boy, still holding his father's hand, looked up at him with a small smile. "Am I safe now, Dad?" he asked softly. The director bent down, his eyes warm. "Yes, son. You are safe. And you've helped make other children safe too." In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. Meetings were no longer places of fear but of cooperation. Residents spoke openly about how to make the community welcoming for everyone. New leadership stepped in, focused not on control but on kindness. Rules were still kept, but they were fair, clear, and never used as a weapon. The boy slowly returned to his bike rides, his stuffed bunny once again tied to the handlebars. At first, his mother walked beside him, but soon he pedaled freely, his laughter ringing through the streets. Neighbors waved as he passed, not out of obligation but out of genuine care. The story spread far beyond the community. News outlets framed it as a lesson: when arrogance and prejudice meet the resilience of truth, justice prevails. Commentators spoke about accountability, about how even small acts of cruelty can grow dangerous if left unchallenged, and how courage, whether from a child, a parent, or a neighbor, can bring change. For the FBI director, it was not about power or influence. It was about a promise kept to his son, and a reminder to the world that justice begins at home, in our neighborhoods, in the way we treat one another each day. And for the community, the lesson was unforgettable: silence can give power to the wrong people, but unity can take it back. Together, they rebuilt not just their neighborhood but their trust in one another. The HOA president faded into history, a symbol of what happens when authority is abused. The boy, on the other hand, became a symbol of hope, proof that even in pain, change is possible, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest strength. The story closed not with anger, but with peace. A child's laughter, once silenced, now filled the streets again. And the neighborhood, once divided, finally became what it was always meant to be, a place of belonging.